When the 3DO launched in 1993, I wanted one so bad that if I had the $700 it cost, I would have slammed it down at any retailer that carried it and took it home. Unfortunately, that kind of money was well beyond my means, so the 3DO had to wait until a price drop in 1994 before it was in striking distance. I actually had to put the 3DO on layaway at a small AV shop in my town that sold TVs and stereo equipment. It took 3 months before I was able to bring it home, but once I did, it was love at first sight. After initially messing around with games like Total Eclipse, The Horde, and John Madden Football, the big hitters began to ship. Road Rash, The Need for Speed, and Alone in the Dark, these games defined my 3DO experience and made 1994 one of the best years I had in gaming. Even with the Saturn and PlayStation on the market, I still kept supporting and playing the 3DO. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, Starblade, Killing Time, Wolfenstein 3D, and Gex were all fantastic titles that I played while waiting for the Saturn and PlayStation market to really get going. My 3DO stayed on the periphery once that happened, but I kept supporting it even after games slowed to a trickle and finally stopped in 1996. During that entire run, I played a number of games that really let me down, but there was one game that utterly shocked me with just how bad it was. That game was Doom, the classic first-person shooter that set off a ton of copycats trying to get in on its monumental success. I had thought for sure that the 3DO would absolutely knock it out of the park when it came to this, especially since similar games had shipped for the unit and had been quite strong already. Sadly, the company and people behind the project were woefully ill-prepared to handle it, and what we received is often considered the worst port of Doom in existence. In this episode, we take a look at Doom for the 3DO, one of my biggest letdowns of the 32-bit era. Doom doesn't really need much of an introduction, nor do I have to explain the mechanics. You know it and you've played it in some form many times before. This version, like most console ports, is based on the original Jaguar release. Same maps, most of the same changes, and it's missing both the Cyber Demon and Spider Demon boss fights. The 3DO controller only has 3 main action buttons, with the L and R shoulder buttons being used for strafing. That means a few concessions when it comes to control. In order to access the map, you have to hold B and hit the P button, or what should otherwise be the start button. Changing weapons also requires a button combination, this time by holding B and cycling with the L and R shoulder buttons. You will also notice the entire information panel that displays your life, armor, keys, and weapons is brown and not the usual gray. Outside of that, it's Doom. You have a weapon fire button, an open door and switch flipping button, and finally a button so you can run. For those of you that appreciate button mapping, you can change around the 3 main action buttons to anything you want. For those curious, this does retain the monster infighting, and you can see the sides and backs of the enemy sprites. The objective is, as always, survive the onslaught of those enemies across 24 levels worth of maze-like adventure. It uses the 3DO's internal memory to save your settings and the last stage you completed. Finally, this features no multiplayer of any kind. It is a one-player experience. This is, quite famously, one of the very worst looking versions of Doom you will ever see for a mainstream product from that era. There is very little here that deserves any sort of praise. It's a bare bones port that lacks any of the fancy lighting effects that were added to the PlayStation version, and the performance is absolutely abysmal. No kidding, I'm talking drops into the single digits where it feels like you can count the frames as they pop off in slow motion. Some of the larger areas are so bad it directly impacts the gameplay, making aiming really tough. Hell, it makes just running in a straight line difficult. You can try and offset some of this by adjusting the screen size, similar to that of the PC editions, but even this never gets the game smooth. You can adjust the screen size down to a postage stamp, and it still runs laughably bad. Funny thing is, the largest default setting for the window is still not full screen. In order to get close to a full screen presentation, you need to enter a cheat, and after you do that, the pain gets even worse in regards to performance. This comes in direct contrast to previous first-person shooters on the 3DO. Wolfenstein 3D ran like butter, and even the framey killing time looked like it was 60 frames per second next to the nightmare of 3DO Doom. One of the lone positive areas to its visuals were the perfectly translucent Spectre demons. These ghost-like enemies look fantastic and can be hard to spot in darker areas of the game. But I cannot stress enough how disappointing this was at its release. There was just no way a system like the 3DO should have done a classic title like this so poorly. Just what the heck happened here? Doom has always had a very atmospheric soundtrack, and it's here that the 3DO release shines brightest. This is the rock remix of the original tunes, and it works on every level. These tunes hit hard and fit every stage like a glove. Up until this point, Doom had never sounded like this, and it was a huge win in a game that was otherwise a massive letdown. Let's have a listen. As is often the case in any form of art or content creation, the story behind the product is more interesting than the product itself. In 1995, a very small startup studio called Art Data Interactive scored the rights to make a 3DO Doom port and ship it by Christmas of that year. The founder of Art Data, Randy Scott, sought out Rebecca Ann Heineman, the programmer responsible for the outstanding Wolfenstein 3D and Out of This World ports to the 3DO, as well as the console exclusive Killing Time. But Mr. Scott was not a seasoned developer or programmer, and had no idea what it would take to actually port Doom to the 3DO. He led Rebecca Heineman into believing that most of the work was already done, that all she really needed to do was wrap up the project and get it shipped. The work he referenced in his initial pitch tour were actually mocked up JPEG images and some live action video he had made of things he wanted in the game. That's right, 3DO fans, he believed that what he had made so far could just be copy and pasted into a retail game with little effort. Once Rebecca Heineman realized the nightmare she had just been dropped into, she had less than 10 weeks to essentially write the code to get the Jaguar Doom running on the 3DO. She never left the office, worked countless hours, and in the end she shipped an unoptimized but fully working Doom port that landed before the end of the year. If you want to hear the full story in greater detail, I highly recommend checking out the programmer's YouTube video, where she recounts the entire ordeal and even answers some questions about it. I'll throw a link down in the description, so be sure to check it out. The sad thing about Doom on the 3DO is what it could have been had it lived up to its initial billing. This game was the poster child of false advertising. Art Data had talked about enhancements well before it released. You see, the original pitch actually had the 3DO Doom sporting full motion video to tell its story, as well as improved visuals, new weapons, new monsters, and new stages. Magazines were basically saying this was going to be a new experience that would make Doom feel new again, and it was only going to be on the 3DO. Hell, even the retail box advertised full-screen visuals that not even the cheats allowed. And the reviews came in as nasty as you'd expect. No one knew Rebecca Heineman's story, so the press was absolutely ruthless in its critique. Most gaming publications ignored it, but when one did take on the task of a review, the results weren't pretty. After reading about this years later, it really made me wonder how often stuff like this happened in the industry. How many times did some games suffer mightily because the people behind it simply didn't know what they were getting into or had an impossible job getting it done? It's really easy to critique a poor looking or running piece of software and dismiss it as indicative of a console's shortcomings. But after reading stories like this, I think it can be just as much a case that the people behind the game either didn't have the time, the resources, or the know-how to actually accomplish the task. How many programmers out there have faced similar situations as Rebecca Heineman and simply haven't told their tale? How many were scared of reprisal or pissing off the people they had to work with within the industry? While many of you likely had no expectations for the 3DO version of Doom, I can tell you as a 3DO fan, I had hopes it would be something unique and special. As it turns out, it kinda was, but for all the wrong reasons. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.